Hey guys! Tonight we're traveling to a place where the walls are ancient. The sky is gray with smoke, and your future depends on a sharpened stick and the structural integrity of a moldy trench. You just woke up in the dirt outside Constantinople. Exact siege TBD. Could be 717, could be 12 Arbo 4, could be 1453. Either way, your odds are the same, impressively bad. The mud is cold. Your blanket smells like someone else's fear, somewhere nearby. A trumpet calls out to absolutely no one in tune. And your commander, who is 19 but already divorced, is screaming at a guy for sneezing too loud. Welcome to your new job, warm-blooded wall decor. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so is the opposing army. And they've got Greek fire, which is basically medieval napalm and possibly black magic. Depending on who you ask, it sticks to things, like armor, and skin, and dignity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is over there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink awake. Technically, you slept. Realistically, you just closed your eyes and hoped rats wouldn't try anything bold. Your bed is a damp trench lined with straw and a few prayer-worthy planks. At least you're not sleeping on the front lip of the ditch anymore. Like poor Gerard, his snoring was legendary. So was his disappearance. Above you, Constantinople looms a mountain of stone walls, moats, watchtowers, and very alert archers who absolutely don't care that you skipped breakfast. You are a footnote in a very long, very bloody siege. And today's task, don't die. Bonus points if you manage not to cry while doing it. Your fellow soldiers stir like hungover moles. There's muttering. There's the sound of someone relieving themselves into a helmet not again. Anton, you sit up. Every joint complains. Your left arm may or may not still be part of your body. It's hard to tell in this temperature. The trench you're in is part home, part coffin. There are dugout sections for firewood, salted food, and something loosely labeled medical supplies. It's a box of rags, 2 needles, and a bottle of wine with a worm in it. You're not sure if the worm is medicinal or a bonus protein source. Either way, it's someone's lunch by noon. Historians still argue whether life in the besieging trenches was organized or more like a chaotic camping trip with frequent fatalities. Based on the sock soup boiling nearby, it's safe to assume it's somewhere in between. And the smell. Oh, the smell. Imagine a wet dog wrapped in cabbage, left inside a smoker's tent for 3 days, and buried under moldy leather. Then, add 3 guys with trench foot and a pile of latrine ash. You glance toward the city. The sun is barely up, but already you can hear shouting in Greek. The clatter of pots from the kitchens inside the wall. And wait, is that a chicken? No, it's a spy, or a chicken. Hard to say from here. You stretch, crack your neck, and try to remember why you signed up. Was it glory, honor, a debt owed? Maybe it was just a bad bet. Either way, you're here now. And Constantinople isn't going to siege itself. You crawl out of your trench bedroom like a mildly concussed mole in last year's socks. The mud welcomes you with a squelch that instantly fills your boot, which is really just a leather pouch pretending to be footwear. It's morning. Allegedly. Hard to tell with the sky. It's the same soup gray as your blanket, your porridge, and your soul. Your sleeping arrangements leave much to be desired. You share your hole with 2 men, 1 beetle colony, and something growing on the wall that may be plotting a coup. The mattress is a pile of straw, so damp it qualifies as a wetland. You once swore it tried to bite you. And if you're lucky, you wake up with only 1 new rash per night. Welcome to the outer trenches of Constantinople, where privacy is a myth and everyone can hear you sleep talk. You shift positions only to knock over someone's chamber pot. Great. That's your second sock ruined this week. And socks are rarer than kind words out here. Your neighbor groans his back is shaped like a question mark from months of trench curling. He's 23, but has the lumbar of a medieval tortoise. You, meanwhile, are entering the ripe age of 21, which is middle-aged by siege standards. Your spine sounds like firewood when you stretch. There's a wooden shack nearby shared, not assigned. It's for meetings, gossip, and storing whatever food hasn't been stolen by rats, or fellow soldiers, or ambitious pigeons. The walls have more holes than logic in a war poem. There's a roof, kind of. It's a patchwork of hide, planks, and wishful thinking. You stagger toward the campfire. Someone's boiling something. It's technically soup, but you recognize yesterday's boot in it, probably for flavor. A guy with 3 teeth and the confidence of a prophet hands you a bowl. It's warm. That's the nicest thing you can say. Historians still argue whether trench life outside Constantinople had any real rhythm. Some say they were morning routines. Some say it was pure chaos. The truth, as usual, is buried under several layers of mud and one extremely loud man trying to brush his teeth with a pine cone. There's no time to relax. Not really. The Byzantines have eyes everywhere. You once sneezed too loud, and 3 arrows landed 6 feet from your tent. Ever since, you've trained yourself to sneeze internally an achievement, but not medically advisable. You glance around at your comrades, all hollowed cheeks, gray hands, and that special stare men get after hearing one too many screams at 3 a.m. Nobody talks about the dreams. You all have them, usually featuring walls, fire, and your mother crying over a poorly sewn tunic. And yet, the worst part isn't the hunger or the fear, it's the waiting. Siege life is 90% anticipation, 5% terror, and 5% digestive regret. You wait for food, for news, for the next trumpet blast, for someone to tell you it's over, for someone to care. You settle back down, soup in hand, feet in mud, back screaming like a banshee in a barrel. Welcome to your morning. You made it, for now. Time to find a toilet, which is to say time to abandon all hope. There are no toilets in the trenches outside Constantinople. Not unless you count that vaguely private spot behind a collapsed cartwheel where 3 other people are already doing their business. Sanitation is more of a shared hallucination than an actual policy here. You trudge through mud, step over something disturbingly soft, and clutch your chamber pot like it's a family heirloom, because in a way, it is. You've named it Greg. The options for relieving yourself are as follows: 1 into Greg, and then launch the contents somewhere hopefully downhill. 2 into a shared pit that smells like it should have voting rights by now. Or 3, very publicly. While pretending this is fine and normal, spoiler, it is not. Toilets, if you can call them that, are a social experiment and often a small public event everyone hears, everyone smells, and everyone pretends not to notice. You find a corner with slightly fewer flies than usual. Do your business. And pray to any god listening that no one important walks by. Unfortunately, the commander does. He raises an eyebrow. You raise your dignity from the mud and try to whistle casually. It doesn't work. Historians still argue whether the latrine line existed an invisible etiquette boundary marking where you could and could not dump waste. Some accounts say soldiers developed elaborate unwritten rules. Others say it was every man for himself and his excrement. You suspect the truth. Once again, lies in the middle of the road, where someone dropped their pot last night. The stench in this place has its own ecosystem. It clings to your clothes, crawls into your pores, and whispers terrible things to your appetite. You haven't had a fresh breath of air since you arrived. Even the wind smells like it's been through something traumatic. Worse yet, there's no such thing as toilet paper. Leaves are used if you're lucky, your sleeve if you're desperate. One creative fellow uses sand. No one sits near him. In theory, you could wash, but the only available water is so contaminated it threatens to unionize every time someone dips a rag in it. Your rank doesn't help. You're not noble enough to have a private latrine, and not desperate enough to join the pit squatters who hum songs to cover the sound of splashing. Class doesn't make things much better, though. Even the officers have to share space with flies and anxiety. A quirky historical tidbit there are accounts of soldiers using old parchment scrolls as wiping material pages of forgotten poems, military orders, even saints' prayers. You once saw someone using a torn bit of religious text. You're not saying he got struck by lightning, but he did fall into the latrine pit 2 days later. Make of that what you will. You return to camp lighter in body and heavier in shame. Greg is sloshing. You rinse it in the river downstream, because you're not a monster, and gag twice in the process. The flies follow you home like loyal dogs. You set Greg down, sigh, and wonder if your nose will ever forgive you. Byzantine trench life, it stinks. Literally and philosophically, it's breakfast time. Or at least, that's what someone calls it. You're not sure the word applies when the meal looks like someone scraped it off the side of a boiling cauldron with a broken spear tip. Your portion today is a grayish lump of barley mash, flavored faintly with despair. It's been cooked overnight in a communal pot that hasn't been scrubbed in a decade, if ever. The texture is best described as moist sand held together with regret. You don't chew it so much as negotiate with it. Occasionally, a bonus item appears in your bowl, maybe a pebble, a twig, or if you're lucky, a dead beetle. The protein is a nice surprise. Historians still argue whether the trench stew recipe ever included actual meat, or if that's just a collective hallucination born from hunger. Some say lizard bits were tossed in during lean weeks. Others claim to have seen pigeon bones. You just know today's stew doesn't blink back at you, and that's a win. Water, don't even ask. The nearby streams are more parasite than liquid, so you drink thin beer because the alcohol, at least, kills something. It tastes like sour bread and smells like wet wheat, but it's safer than the alternative. And you've grown to appreciate the slight buzz. It dulls the edge of reality, which, frankly, has too many edges. You think longingly of fruit, of anything with a color. Everything you eat here is beige, brown, or sad. Spices are a fantasy, mentioned in passing by officers with better connections. Salt is the closest thing to luxury, and even that comes rationed and clumped into sweaty pouches, worn around necks like amulets of taste. Someone nearby is gnawing a biscuit so hard it sounds like combat. Trench biscuits, hardtack, are famous for being indestructible. Some say they were invented not to feed soldiers, but to give them something to hit each other with. Yours is less food and more geological sample. You try to soak it in beer, it resists. You chew anyway. A molar protests. Your neighbor tries to brighten the mood by mentioning an old siege trick, roasting rats over the fire. He claims they taste like oily chicken. You nod politely and decide not to ask how he knows. Another soldier once bragged about a roasted hedgehog feast. You're not sure if it was a joke. You hope it was. Quirky detail of the day. Some Byzantine soldiers reportedly carried garlic cloves as both seasoning and plague protection. You've taken to chewing one before every meal. It doesn't help your breath or your friendships, but you're still here. And that counts for something. Food doesn't comfort here. It merely sustains the body while slowly traumatizing the soul. You swallow your barley paste. Lick the last drop of beer from the rim of your tin cup. And try not to think about the next meal. Because no matter how bad it is now, dinner is just 6 hours away. And it might be the same thing. Again. With fewer beetles. You scratch your arm. Again. Not because you're itchy, which you are, but because scratching is the only thing that reminds you you're still partially human beneath this walking biohazard of a uniform. Clothing in the siege trench isn't designed for comfort. It's not even designed. It's issued, and it hates you. Your tunic is technically wool, but not the cozy kind your grandma might knit. This wool is scratchy, coarse, and full of mystery particles. Dust mold history. You stopped asking questions 3 days in. It's stained in all the wrong places and smells like every moment you've suffered since arrival. You wear it day and night. In theory, you could take it off. In practice, it's fused to you via sweat and regret. Your pants fare no better. They bunch. They cling. And when it rains, and it always rains, they become heavy, soggy ropes that lash your legs with every step. You've developed a gait best described as cursed sailor. Underwear. You don't talk about that here. You certainly don't have it anymore. Your socks are a particularly cruel joke. Knitted so loosely that pebbles walk right in, yet somehow tight enough to saw through your ankles. You lost one last week and replaced it with torn linen from a letter your mother sent. Historians still argue whether personal correspondence counts as viable clothing during siege conditions. You're too itchy to care. Shoes. Technically, yes. Practically, no. Your leather boots are cracked, waterlogged, and about as waterproof as a sponge with abandonment issues. They never fully dry. The soles flap open like mouths ready to confess their sins. You stuff straw in them for insulation, then pull it out again when the straw starts crawling. Because, oh yes, parasites. You've made some unlikely friends down here. Fleas, lice, and trench mites have become constant, loyal companions. The lice live in your seams and throw tiny parties you're never invited to. The fleas don't even hide anymore. They leap dramatically across your blanket like circus performers. Someone said once that an army marches on its stomach. You think it actually limps forward on fungal infections. Your feet are blistered, trench-rotted, and smell like philosophical despair. Washing them isn't an option. There's no clean water. And even if there were, washing would only tempt fate. You spot a fellow soldier near the latrines, beating his shirt against a rock like it owes him money. He believes he's doing laundry, really. He's just getting the shirt wetter and angrier. Still, it's the effort that counts. There's a rumor that the Emperor's elite guards wear silk-lined cloaks. You'd murder for a pillowcase made of that, or even just the idea of something soft. Historians still debate whether comfort was ever experienced at any point during the siege. Some say a noble once imported a velvet scarf from Venice. He probably died choking on it. In the rare moment your body stops moving, the itching intensifies. Lice don't like you working. They prefer it when you're still. Then they party harder. You give in and scratch. Then again, and again. Eventually, the itch becomes a rhythm, a battle drum of survival. Your clothes, your boots, your skin, they're all working against you. But you've learned the golden rule of siege warfare: if it doesn't kill you immediately, it becomes part of your outfit. So you pull your cloak tighter, brush off a beetle, and keep walking. At least the lice make good conversation. Your tooth starts to throb before you even open your eyes. It's not a new pain, more of a returning guest. Like a relative who doesn't knock and eats all your food. Somewhere along your bottom jaw, near the molar, you suspect has been quietly rotting for months. The pressure builds like a medieval drum line. You try to ignore it. Maybe it'll go away. Spoiler, it won't. There are no toothbrushes in your trench outside Constantinople. No mouthwash. No floss. No peppermint gum to mask the horror show behind your lips. There's only stale bread, acidic vinegar wine, and a slow erosion of hope. If you're lucky, you occasionally get a twig to chew on something from the local shrubbery with vague cleansing properties. But mostly, oral hygiene means spitting when something tastes like pus and hoping the smell doesn't kill morale. Toothpaste. You dream of it. The Byzantine elite were said to use crushed pearls and mint in theirs. A recipe so outrageously luxurious it could finance an entire regiment. You, meanwhile, have plaque that could qualify as a building material. There's a man in your unit, Litos, who lost 2 teeth last week after biting into dried goat meat. He coughed, spat, and handed you a molar like it was a coin. You buried it next to the latrines, out of respect. When things get really bad, and they will, you turn to the dentist. He's not a dentist. He's the least squeamish man in the squad and owns pliers. That's all it takes to qualify. He sterilizes them by waving them near a torch and muttering a prayer. Then he braces his knee on your chest, yells 1, 2, 3, and the rest is a blur of screaming, blood, and hallucinating that you're a pigeon. The medieval understanding of dental pain can be summarized as something evil is trapped in your jaw, and we must let it out. Sometimes they burn herbs and waft the smoke toward your face. Sometimes they whisper spells. Sometimes they just hit you until you stop complaining. Historians still argue whether jaw drilling or tooth pulling was more humane. You suggest they test both theories personally. As your gums swell and your breath becomes a weapon of mass destruction, you realize you're learning to live with pain, not out of bravery, but because it's the only option. You drink hot broth and feel it sizzle along exposed nerves. You bite gingerly with one side. You avoid smiling, not out of gloom, but because you look like a haunted pumpkin with tooth decay. And then there are the fringe remedies. One soldier swears that smearing clay on your cheeks draws the evil spirits out. Another chews garlic and says it works unless the pain's from sin. A third suggests kissing a frog under the moon. He's either joking or completely unwell. Sometimes you rub vinegar on your gums. It burns, but at least it distracts you in a cruel twist. Byzantines believed that toothaches were divine punishment for gossip. You want to argue, but your jaw is too swollen, so you suffer and keep suffering. Because in the trenches outside Constantinople, pain isn't an exception. It's the dress code. By the time the sun rises over the horizon, assuming the fog, smoke, and general despair let you see it, you're already working. Or, more accurately, already being worked. Your body isn't yours. It belongs to the siege. You dig trenches, stack rocks, haul wood, refill ditches, smear tar, swing pickaxes, mend palisades, carry boiling oil. And if you're really unlucky, rebuild the same wall that collapsed last night during a freak windstorm or goat stampede. It's hard to tell these days. There are no weekends in the trenches, no tea breaks, no overtime pay. The concept of rest is mostly theoretical, like clean water or a letter from home. You were told you'd rotate shifts. You were told you'd get watch breaks. You were told many things. Most of them were lies. Because the siege outside Constantinople is a full-time occupation. And guess what? You're the intern. Congratulations. You start the day ankle-deep in mud. Your only tool, a wooden spade, with splinters the size of arrows. Your boots gave out last week. So now it's wet cloth wrapped around your feet. Which fun fact doesn't protect against trench rot? Or fire ants? Or Byzantine arrows? One of your comrades has trench rot so bad his toes look like pickled onions. The surgeon says to keep them dry. That's hilarious. The trenches are never dry. You might as well tell a fish to stay away from the ocean. There's a lot of yelling. Always yelling. Some of it is in Greek. Some in Latin. Some in a universal soldier dialect of groans. Swear-like noises. And occasional sobbing. You're building a siege tower today. It's a miracle of engineering in the same way a pile of flaming logs is a miracle of fire prevention. It's made of wood. bound with twine, reinforced with hopes and spit. You drag beams with 6 other men. 2 collapse. 1 disappears. You don't ask questions. Every so often, you hear a cry. From the front line, someone has been promoted or pierced. The reactions are often the same. There are no elevators, no pulleys, no back braces. You lift with your knees and pray your spine doesn't declare independence. Women in nearby encampments also work carrying water, washing linen, tending to wounded, cooking gruel so thick it qualifies as construction paste. Some even sneak into the front lines disguised as men, driven not by glory, but by desperation. Children. Oh, they work too. They carry arrows, patch leather, and sometimes climb into crevices to set fire to enemy supplies. Historians still argue whether that counts as bravery or child labor. You lean toward child survival. Other jobs exist. Of course, smiths, fletchers, messengers, but even those roles are brutal. The blacksmith's hands are a mosaic of burns. The tanner smells like fermented regret. And the messenger's average life expectancy is the same as a mayfly's. There's no HR department. Your only promotion path is surviving long enough to become the one who knows how the ladder works. That makes you senior staff. You'll get a stick with notches on it. Maybe even a nickname. By midday, your shirt is soaked through, your hands raw, your spine humming like a broken lyre. You eat standing up, chewing last week's bread like it's a moral test. Then it's back to work. And tomorrow, more of the same. Because out here, outside a greatest walled city on earth, you don't conquer the fortress, you survive the labor camp around it. If the Byzantine walls don't kill you, the weather might. You wouldn't think weather would be a major combatant in a siege. But, oh, it absolutely is. In fact, it might be the only force more persistent than the supply shortage. Let's start with the heat. You wake up in what can best be described as a communal bread oven made of canvas, leather scraps, and your own body odor. The sun hasn't even risen properly, but the air is already thick enough to chew. You roll over bad idea, only to realize that your straw bedding has fused to your skin. Moisture, yes, but not from a pleasant tropical dew. More like a warm broth of man sweat, rotting fabric, and yesterday's despair. You stumble out of your tent and straight into a swarm of flies the size of cavalry horses. You swat them away and immediately regret it. Your arm sticks to your tunic like it's been dipped in tree sap. There is no wind, no shade, just the sizzling promise that today you'll either pass out from heat stroke or go blind from the sun bouncing off metal helmets. And now for the rainy season, which sounds better. It isn't when it rains. The entire encampment transforms into a glorious soup of mud, dung, and shredded morale. Tents collapse, footing vanishes, the latrine trenches fill and overflow, meaning that surprise. You're sleeping 10 feet from what historians politely call the biohazard zone. If you thought rats were bad before, imagine them now bloated, belligerent, and well-fed. And when it's not rats, it's mosquitoes. Mosquitoes large enough to qualify as messengers. Their bites itch like shame and swell like grapes. You scratch. You regret it. Infection sets in. And guess what? You just earned yourself a nickname, Swollen Larry. Now imagine winter. The cold doesn't arrive politely. It crashes into camp like a drunk noble at a wedding feast. One night, you're rolling up your sleeves. The next, you're stuffing hay into your tunic just to avoid turning into a popsicle. Firewood is rationed, assuming you even get any. Most of the heat comes from huddling, yes. You now have a designated huddle buddy. It's not romantic. It's logistical. Because the frostbite isn't metaphorical. Your breath fogs in front of your face like ghostly regrets. Water freezes in your cup. Your fingers go numb. You try to piss and discover that even your bodily functions are staging a labor protest. Remember your boots. They're frozen. Your shirt, damp and cold. Your joints, more creaky than the siege tower's support beams. And yet, you still have to work. You still have to march. You still have to climb ladders, repair catapults, and haul boiling pitch across ice-slick paths. Every step is a gamble. Every breath a dare. What do you wear well? Assuming you're lucky? It's a layer of wool so scratchy it doubles as emotional punishment. Add a cloak that absorbs rain like a sponge, and a helmet that either traps heat or channels hail directly into your face. Historians still argue whether the lack of uniform weather preparation was an oversight or a deliberate test of loyalty. You think it was just budget cuts. There's a reason siege warfare was considered slow and miserable. The enemy isn't just Constantinople. It's the weather, and it never negotiates. Water the ultimate betrayal. You'd think that during a siege outside one of the most sophisticated cities in the world, the least of your worries would be water. Constantinople, after all, has aqueducts, cisterns, and a terrifyingly smug attitude about it. But you're not inside Constantinople, are you? You're camped outside, in a trench that doubles as a wishing well for dysentery. Let's start with the basics. The camp has a water system, which is an optimistic term for a pit that collects rain, runoff, and regret. It smells like old secrets and looks like it's planning something. You hold your nose, dip your cup in, and try not to think about the number of feet, horses, or bowels that have visited this puddle before you. Still thirsty. Good. Let's talk about bathing. You don't, not really. A bath consists of rubbing your arms with a rag soaked in disappointment. Soap is rare. Warm water is rarer. The closest thing you've had to a proper wash is standing in the rain while a fellow soldier mocks your hair. You don't complain because bathing, bizarrely, is considered dangerous. Doctors, and we use that term lightly, believe that opening your pores might also open your soul to disease. So the goal is to remain sealed like a pickled onion. That's right, the cleaner you feel, the closer to death you must be. Hooray for hygiene. Need to drink something? You've got 3 options. Stale beer that tastes like bread's evil cousin. Wine watered down to sadness. Water that's so dubious it practically whispers. Dare you, but if you don't drink, you'll pass out before noon. And if you do drink, well, you'll spend the night reenacting every bodily horror known to medieval medicine. Diarrhea, fever, vomiting, and worms, yes. Actual worms can all arrive courtesy of 1 sip too many from the communal barrel. And don't think you're safe if you boil it. Sometimes, the wood smoke adds its own delightful bouquet of soot and carcinogens. Or you overboil and turn it into a stew of floating ash and melted tin from the pot lining. Crunchy hydration. Toilet options, please. The pit latrines overflow daily. You dig a hole, you use it, and you pray the guy before you wasn't a sharpshooter. Some soldiers use chamber pots. Some just go in a bush. Either way, modesty has left the building. And sanitation, that's a word from the future. You quickly learn 2 things. Your body no longer obeys you. Water is not your friend. It's a test. Historians still argue whether the siege camps intentionally neglected water safety as a form of population control or simply lacked the logistical infrastructure. You argue that your intestines are filing a formal complaint. But hey, at least the Byzantines are thirsty too. Inside their grand walls, cisterns are drying. Wells are running low. They're rationing, just like you. It's a slow motion thirst off, until someone, probably a noble, suggests digging a tunnel to poison Constantinople's supply. Bold, risky, doomed. But the idea still earns him applause, mostly because everyone's delirious. And so, as you swish your cup around, trying to guess whether it's just dirt or something more alive, you raise a silent toast to irony. In a world surrounded by the Bosphorus, water might be the thing that kills you first. The night is thick with fog, curling over the trenches like a damp blanket woven from cannon smoke and sweat. The sounds of siege fade to a murmur, just the creak of a bowstring far off. The sleepy shuffle of boots in mud, and somewhere, a cough that hasn't stopped since yesterday. You pull your cloak tighter. It doesn't help much, but it gives your hands something to do. Your feet are sore, your throat is raw, and your thoughts drift slow, soft, like silt in river water, toward the idea of warmth, or quiet. A room with walls that aren't made of dirt, and still, you breathe. Still here, still awake. Not much cleaner, certainly not braver, but maybe just a little wiser than this morning. So as the stars blink lazily above Constantinople, and the fires die down to embers, let yourself settle. Let your muscles remember how to loosen. Let your heartbeat slow to match the silence. The city can wait. The war can wait. You've made it through another day outside the greatest walls ever built. And for now, that is enough. Now, we begin in a room made entirely of stone. The ceiling arches above you like a stubborn rib cage. The walls are lined with damp breath, and your feet are bare against freezing flagstones. The only decoration is a small wooden crucifix splintered, off-center, and likely older than your family tree. You're 17, or maybe 16. No one asked. All you know is that the cart you rode in yesterday was not taking you to your cousin's wedding. It was your wedding. To God. A groom with no face, and a church that doesn't serve cake. The iron bell rings dull and judgmental, calling all women to matins. You shuffle along with the others in your itchy woolen robe, trying not to slip on the algae that grows freely in the corridor corners. This is the Benedictine Abbey of St. Walpurga, and you, a minor noble's daughter, are now its newest resident. You would never think that cloistered for eternity would be considered a promotion over being married to a bald old tax collector, but here we are. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is, because somewhere in the world, someone's chanting in Latin while eating turnips, and it might as well be us. You didn't ask to be here. But let's face it, asking was never really part of the medieval daughter's curriculum. While your brothers got to sword fight and complain about inheritance, your options came down to 3 basic life paths. Get married off like an extra goat in a treaty. Die in childbirth while being ignored by your midwife. Or enter a convent and hope God likes your voice. Your father chose door number 3, possibly because dowries for abbeys were cheaper than those for human husbands. Possibly because you were clever and liked books, a dangerous trait in a girl who wasn't born into a library. Historians still argue whether most noble women truly embraced the cloistered life out of piety, or simply did so because there wasn't a 4th option. Either way, you quickly learn that peaceful devotion actually translates into cold rooms, endless rules, and boiled cabbage that doubles as air freshener. You attend Mass 7 times a day. You sleep in shifts. You eat in silence, accompanied by a nun reading scripture aloud, a voice so monotone, you're sure it could kill livestock at 20 paces. You try not to think about your former home, about soft furs, buttered bread, and windows that weren't made for defense. But occasionally, as the incense curls around you like a lazy ghost, and candle wax pools like forgotten honey, you feel something close to calm. Not joy. Not yet. But maybe the kind of stillness that lives in stone and is passed from nun to nun like second-hand prayer. One historical fact: convents in the Holy Roman Empire were political sanctuaries, educational centers, and prisons all rolled into one. A fringe tidbit: some convents kept pet monkeys. Yes, monkeys. No one knows why. And scholars still debate whether cloistered life was oppressive or quietly liberating for women who otherwise had no stage. For now, you're not thinking about liberation. You're thinking about how long it takes for moss to grow on the inside of a chapel. By the time you figure out the rhythm of the bells, your old name has started to fade. They've given you a new one. Something biblical. Something Latin. Something so similar to 3 other sisters that you're not entirely sure who's being summoned half the time. You answer anyway. It's safer that way. Also, you no longer refer to time in days. It's just between lauds and prime now, like a particularly grim sandwich. Life in the convent doesn't try to surprise you. It's a loop. You pray. You scrub. You copy texts. You pretend not to hear the old nun muttering about St. Ursula's 11,000 virgins like it's a sports score. Occasionally, you garden, which is a poetic term for wrestling snails away from dying cabbage. But something shifts in week 3. You hear laughter. Not yours, definitely not yours. It comes from the scriptorium, where another girl, Sister Beatrix, has found a cracked piece of vellum with a doodle of a nun chasing a goose with a broom. Illuminated marginalia, she says with a wink. God's little editorial notes. That's how the rebellion begins. Quiet, handwritten, and absurdly polite. You and Beatrix start noticing them everywhere. Tiny medieval graffiti tucked in the corners of serious manuscripts. Monks vomiting in bushes. Cats playing harps. A bishop riding a snail. You'd think that life behind cloistered walls would dry out imagination like salted cod. But it doesn't. It ferments it into something gloriously weird. Historians still argue whether these marginal drawings were acts of protest, inside jokes, or just the 11th century equivalent of doodling during a lecture. Whatever they were, they kept people sane. And maybe, just maybe, they kept you from drifting entirely into candlewax stupor. Beatrix is the closest thing you have to a friend here. She once tried to smuggle honeycomb from the refectory just to make your dry oatcake less like penance and more like food. It didn't work. The honey melted. The oatcake remained aggressively holy. One day, while copying a particularly long homily, Beatrix whispers, "I dreamt I was riding a horse last night. A real one. My hair wasn't covered. And I was laughing." You stare at the ink on your fingers and feel something unspoken tighten in your throat. The worst part of this place isn't the food or the cold. It's that dreams are the most dangerous things you're allowed to keep. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval nunneries often served as de facto schools for noble daughters. Quirky tidbit. Some nuns were caught hiding love letters inside hollowed-out prayer books. And scholars, they're still debating whether such convents crushed or preserved individuality, whether these women were erased or somehow archived that night, while the others murmur prayers in chorus. You glance over at Beatrix and catch her mouthing something different. Not Latin, not scripture. Just a name. You don't ask who it is. But for the first time in weeks, you smile. Your first winter behind convent walls arrives like a vengeful ghost with frostbitten fingers. You wake to find your breath clouding in front of you, like a tiny soul trying to escape. The stone floors are a form of punishment nobody wrote down. And the water basin feels like it's been imported from the Arctic Circle, which doesn't exist yet, geographically speaking, but your knuckles invent it anyway. Beatrix, ever the optimist, suggests heating the ink pot under a candle to keep it fluid. It promptly catches fire. You both laugh a little too hard for 2 girls who are technically supposed to be silent until terse. Laughter, as it turns out, is the closest thing to rebellion in the cloister, second only to sitting slightly crooked during Vespers. Daily life continues in a haze of Gregorian chant and blistered fingers. You've now memorized 3 psalms, 4 saints' feast days, and the exact angle at which the abbess glares when someone sneezes during Mass. It's 23 degrees, she must have trained it with a compass. Meals are an exercise in restraint lentils, stale rye bread, and something that might have been a root vegetable before it became a texture experiment. Still, there are odd comforts. The convent cat, known as Domina Whiskeria, among the younger sisters, has appointed herself as your lap warmer during script duty. She may be a reincarnated bishop, or just a furry anarchist. You respect both possibilities. One afternoon, while repairing a damaged manuscript, you stumble upon a curious passage in a translated saint's life, a noblewoman who entered a convent not for faith, but because she had recurring dreams of a man with sun-colored hair riding across a lake on a boat made of bones. You pause. That's oddly specific. Beatrix peers over your shoulder and whispers, "Do you think dreams choose us, or do we sneak into them, hoping they'll let us stay? The days shorten. Snow piles against the sills. Someone falls ill, and the infirmary fills with the smell of vinegar and old prayers. You and Beatrix are assigned to copying a new set of legal texts, dry as a monk's humor and twice as long. But one evening, a folded paper slips out from between two pages. On it, a sketch of a nun dancing barefoot beneath a full moon. She looks alarmingly like you. Historians still argue whether these tucked-away drawings were private expressions or coded messages. Some say they were practice sheets. Others suggest secret art therapy. You suspect they're simply echoes, tiny rebellions humming beneath the surface of obedience. Mainstream fact-illuminated manuscripts were often copied by nuns in double scriptoria convents across Germany. Quirky fringe tidbit one abbess allegedly banned red ink because she believed it made the devil feel too welcome. So, you start hiding sketches of your own. A tree with a door. A woman with one foot in water, the other in fire. A moon made of stitched cloth. You're not sure why. Only that it makes the quiet less loud. And maybe, in some quiet future, someone will find them and wonder who you were before the prayers, before the frost, before the name they gave you. The convent's bell tolls 5 times before the sun rises, because nothing says spiritual enlightenment like being startled awake by iron thunder in the dark. You dress in layers, the wool scratchy and designed to remind you that comfort is for afterlives. In the refectory, steam rises from bowls of barley porridge with the same enthusiasm as a bored ghost. You chew slowly, because there's nothing else to do, and because silence is enforced so thoroughly that even spoons have learned to behave. Today, you're assigned to garden duty, which sounds poetic, till you realize it means breaking frozen earth with a rusted spade while pretending you enjoy it. Beatrix makes up new saints just to get through it. Saint Gloriana of blisters, patron of frostbitten hands. You nod solemnly and appoint yourself bishop of mossy radishes. Still, there's something oddly grounding in the monotony. You learn how carrots don't care about your dreams, how cabbage, when angry, splits sideways, how earthworms are better companions than most noblemen. You're no longer the girl who arrived blinking through a veil of incense and fear. You're the girl who can compost disappointment into serviceable soil. Then one morning, a rider appears at the gates. Not unusual in itself, convents often received parcels, letters, or deeply confused pilgrims, but this rider carries a scroll marked with a wax seal you once knew well. Your family crest. It flutters in your chest like a bird who just remembered it has wings. The abbess reads the scroll with the emotional expression of an ancient stone. She says nothing, just gestures for you to follow her into her study. Inside, the fire crackles with suspicious cheerfulness. She hands you the scroll. The handwriting is familiar. Your brother's. The letter says your cousin has died. She had no heirs, her estate lands, livestock, and a questionably haunted windmill will now pass to you, unless you refuse. But there's a catch, as there always is, to claim it. You must leave the convent before your final vows. You have until the feast of St. Hildegard to decide. If not, the estate passes to a distant uncle, who collects dead bees and believes women can't read. You return to your cell. Beatrix is waiting. She sees your face, reads the worry there, like a psalter. She doesn't ask. She just lights a second candle and sits with you in the silence. Mainstream, historical fact. Some noble families placed daughters in convents, not out of piety, but politics using monastic life as a placeholder until better inheritance opportunities emerged. Quirky tidbit. Certain convents had escape tunnels, not for emergencies, but discreet reassignments. Historians still argue whether these were built by the nuns themselves or were generous architectural accidents. That night, you dream again. The woman from before, barefoot in moonlight, walks through a gate carved into a mountain. She turns to look at you. She wears a crown of birch leaves and a robe of stars. She says nothing, just waits. You wake unsure whether the dream was a warning, a welcome, or simply the mind's way of making decisions feel magical. So now, you're caught between a vow and a windmill. Not metaphorically. There's quite literally a windmill involved. One that reportedly groans at night like it remembers being a dragon. You'd almost forgotten about your cousin. She was older, stern, and once gave you a dead bird as a birthday gift to teach you impermanence. You never liked her. And now she's left you everything. You wander the cloister that week, like someone who just learned they inherited a kingdom and a snake pit in equal measure. Beatrix senses the shift. "Are you going to take it?" she asks one afternoon, pretending to trim lavender that refuses to grow. You shrug, but something in your shrug says maybe. You make a list, a real one, in charcoal, on the back of a parchment about proper hymn posture. Pros of leaving the convent. Own land and windmill. Free yourself from 4:45 a.m. Bells. Possibly have your own bathtub luxury. Be a person, not a silent candle watcher. Cons. Break everyone's expectations. Risk being seen as ungrateful. No more Beatrix. May accidentally marry a baron who eats soup with a dagger. The abbess asks for your answer the day before the feast. You say nothing, but nod. A slow, reluctant nod that feels like pushing a boat into dark water without knowing where the river bends. And then you wake before dawn, not to the bell, but to the sound of footsteps in the corridor. It's Beatrix. She holds a small satchel. "If you're leaving," she says softly, "take this." Inside, one dried apple, one bronze brooch shaped like a thistle, and one piece of paper with her name written in it. Can't tell if it's a farewell or a plea. You travel back toward your family estate in a cart that smells like onions and oaths. The road is long. Mud decides it's in charge. Wheels wobble. You find yourself missing even the porridge. But you also breathe a little deeper. Each mile feels like unwrapping a bandage. The estate is worse than you remember. Roof caved in. A chicken roosting on a windowsill. The windmill still groaning. But the land is yours. And so is the silence. Historical fact, in 11th century Germany, noblewomen could inherit estates if no male heirs were available. But doing so often meant relinquishing religious vows, sometimes viewed as a social betrayal. Quirky tidbit. Some nuns who left convents still secretly wore their veils during thunderstorms, convinced it protected them from judgmental lightning. Historians still argue whether many of these departures were voluntary or orchestrated by family pressure. You stand in what used to be your cousin's garden. The flowers are gone, but something tiny pushes through the frost. A violet, or maybe a weed pretending to be romantic. And just before dusk, a rider arrives, not with a threat, not with an order, with a marriage proposal. Because, of course, you know the proposal is going to be ridiculous before you even open the scroll. The parchment is thick, thicker than necessary, like it's compensating for what it's about to say. The wax seal is unbroken. The horse is still steaming. And the rider, he looks like he hasn't blinked since mines. You sit on a cracked stone step and read aloud to the indifferent wind, to the lady of the West Mill Estate, formerly of St. Kilda's Convent, I. Otto von Berenstein, widower and second cousin to the late Countess Matilda. Present my intent of union in hopes of you stop, not for dramatic effect. Just to make sure you aren't hallucinating on beet soup fumes. Yes, he's serious. You reread it. Otto wants to marry you not out of love, nor lust, nor even loneliness. No, because the land next to your windmill happens to flood. And your garden does not. It's not a romance. It's irrigation. You consider it. Of course. It's the 11th century. And saying no to a marriage proposal as a land-owning woman is basically a declaration of war via embroidery. But then you do something shocking. You ask for time. And Otto agrees. Probably because he's off trying to find a better comb for his mustache. That night, you think. You sit by a candle stub and consider what your convent self would do. She'd pray. You make a pros and cons list again. Pros of marrying Otto's stable household. No more goat herding alone. Access to his family's suspiciously nice cellar. Cons would be married to a man who once described cheese as distrustful. Lose your independence. Might die from boredom before plague gets a chance. But that's not what settles it. What does is the dream. You fall asleep and dream you are back in the cloister, but it's covered in moss, like it's been abandoned for centuries. And Beatrix is there, but she's planting something. When you ask what, she says, not escape, just roots. You wake up at dawn, oddly clear-headed. Otto arrives later that day with a small sack of flour and a smile that doesn't quite reach his ears. I've thought about your offer. You begin, and you don't even let him respond before adding, I decline. There's a pause so long, you hear the windmill sigh behind you. Otto shrugs, mildly offended. Suit yourself, he mutters. The geese are easier to talk to anyway. Historical fact in the High Middle Ages. Noble widowers frequently sought to remarry for land consolidation rather than companionship. Quirky tidbit. Some suitors mailed proposals with locks of horsehair or barley seeds as gifts of fertility. Historians still argue whether women like you truly had autonomy or were just experts at dodging things until everyone gave up. You close the door after Otto leaves. Not with drama, just with quiet certainty. And then, because you can, you go dig up a bit of earth near the groaning windmill and plant the thistle brooch Beatrix gave you. It's not meant to grow, but you think she'd find that funny. A week passes. The world does not end. Your fields continue to be unruly. Your chickens continue their campaign of passive resistance. Your boots still leak when it rains. But there is something else. A hush. As if the air around your home has noticed that you said no to a nobleman. And it's standing and polite. Stunned silence. Waiting to see what you do next. You do laundry. You cook cabbage until even the ghosts flee. You chase the goat out of the pantry for the 3rd time this week. You live. And that, it turns out, is enough of a revolution. Then one morning, the bells toll. Not church bells. Not wedding bells. Funeral. You walk into town in your usual mud-streaked attire. No one notices, or rather, they notice you the way they notice the sky present. Inevitable. But not worth comment unless it starts raining. The funeral is for Hildegund, the miller's daughter, barely 17, fever, gone in 2 days. You stand in the back and listen to the priest speak of obedience, virtue, and eternal reward. You watch your mother quietly collapse inward, and something inside you hardens, not into anger, into clarity. Because you remember Hildegund from before the plague, when she asked you if she'd be allowed to read the Psalms out loud in Latin someday. And you said, "Why not?" And she laughed and said, "Because girls aren't allowed to dream that big." Historical fact, in the 11th century, literacy among women, especially outside of the convent, was rare and discouraged. Quirky tidbit. Some noble women who secretly learned to read did so using embroidered samplers that hid letters and floral patterns. Historians still argue whether informal female education was tolerated or just conveniently ignored. You trudge back home through puddles the size of small fjords. That night, you light 2 candles, one for Hildegund and one for Beatrix. And then you do something not written in any convent rulebook. You begin to teach the village girls. Not openly, not with banners or scrolls. You start by pretending you're just mending clothes in the evening. Then you happen to sound out Latin prayers aloud. And then you accidentally leave out chalk and slates near the mill. They pick it up fast. Kids always do. Especially when they're not told they're not supposed to. They begin whispering the alphabet like it's a secret incantation. And you pretend not to smile when one of them tells her brother, "Only girls allowed today." The convent bride is gone. The mill teacher has quietly taken her place. And oddly enough, the goats now seem slightly better behaved. Probably coincidence. Probably. The girls call you mistress now. Not sister, not bride of Christ, just mistress. As if you were some wise old witch from the forest minus the spells, plus a worrying amount of goats. You teach them letters carved into stones, rhymes hidden in hymnals, and numbers scratched with sticks in the dirt. They sit in circles around you like little scholars of mischief, chewing on wild mint and whispering secrets. It's not a proper school. It's better, because no one can shut down something that doesn't officially exist. You start collecting pages, scraps, broken off bindings, torn psalters, a book that fell from a passing cart during a storm, a misshapen codex gifted by a wandering friar who said, "I heard you do something strange and good." You thank him. You don't ask how he knows. Word travels faster than chickens, slower than shame, but somehow more efficiently than both. Historical fact. While formal education for girls in the 11th century was limited to convents, there is growing evidence of informal literacy circles, particularly led by widows or ex-nuns across Germanic towns. Quirky tidbit. Some early German woodcuts show women reading aloud to chickens. Historians still argue whether this was satire or genuinely instructional. And now the town is changing, ever so slightly. The boys get annoyed. One demands to know why his sister knows how to recite the Nicene Creed backward. Another pouts because the girls won't let him into the learning circle unless he brings 2 eggs and swears not to fart. It's an exclusive club, after all. One day, you find a parchment pinned to your door. It's unsigned. Just one phrase, penned in shaky Latin, "Non est opus tuae doctrinae." Your teaching is not needed. You stare at it for a long time. Then you use it to light the fire. Later that week, another note appears. Same hand. This time, it reads, "Fiat voluntas tua." Let your will be done. You hang that one inside your door. The men of the village pretend not to notice you, but their daughters are now trading riddles in Latin, naming herbs by their Greek roots, and arguing about whether Saint Ursula actually had 11,000 virgins with her, or whether someone just misread a very optimistic footnote. The church doesn't interfere. Perhaps they're too tired. Or perhaps they finally realize that teaching girls to read does not summon demons, lower crop yields, or cause spontaneous goat combustion. You're not trying to change the world. You're just trying to shift the weight of it slightly, so it doesn't fall entirely on the backs of the voiceless. And every now and then, in the quiet of dusk, you look at the horizon and whisper a name you were once forced to forget. Not as a prayer, not as regret, just to remember that you were once a girl in a dress of wool, reading dreams between the lines of psalms, and that, somewhere, she's proud of what you've become. You keep the mornings slow now. The hens cluck with a rhythm you've grown to appreciate, like nature's gossip circle. The dew hangs heavy, as if the sky itself is reluctant to leave the comfort of its bed sheets. Your breath fogs in the air, but not with urgency, just presence. Sometimes you still wear the veil, not because you must, but because it's warm, and because some habits take decades to unravel. Other times, your hair is loose, gray, wild as weeds, and the girls plait flowers into it while reciting riddles in Old High German. You don't correct them. Getting it wrong is part of getting it right. You dream less of cloisters now, and more of sunlit fields where books grow like cabbages. In your dreams, everyone reads, even the goats, especially the goats. The scriptorium pages you once longed to see are distant, blurry things. You no longer chase parchment. You grow it symbolically. Of course, your garden is full of half-finished stories, waiting to bloom. Historical fact. In late medieval Germany, some women who left convent life became informal scribes or community herbalists. Quirky tidbit. One nun in the 11th century apparently insisted her chickens could sense which manuscripts were blasphemous. Historians still argue whether that was metaphor or just a particularly judgmental hen. Today, a girl places something in your hand. It's clumsily wrapped in wool thread, tied with a knot that says, "I tried," inside a scrap of parchment with a shaky drawing. A nun, a tree. A small crowd gathered beneath, reading. You look at her, and she shrugs like it's nothing. But her ears are bright red. It's not nothing. It's the entire point. And so, you sit beneath that very real tree, with your very real legs stretched in the grass. And the breeze carries laughter that doesn't belong to God or man or monastery. It belongs to you. The wind down begins slowly, just as it should. The pages close, the candles dim, and the hum of distant bells becomes little more than a whisper. You let the silence wrap around you like your oldest shawl, the kind with holes, stories, and comfort stitched between every thread. You are not a bride, not a nun, not a scholar, not a heretic. You are what's left when the labels fade and the voices go quiet. You are peace in a world that once refused to name you. And now, dear listener, so are you. Close your eyes. Breathe gently. Somewhere, a goat just sneezed in the distance, and even that, somehow, is part of your story. Sleep well now. We open our eyes to the dull gray of a storm-racked tower. Wind hisses through the cracks in the stone, as if even the weather is gossiping about what happened here. You're in Scotland, 14th century, not exactly known for its warm hospitality or reasonable husbands. The fire's gone out, assuming it was ever lit, and the scent in the air is part mildew, part cooked barley, and part quiet desperation. And you would never think that a woman could be locked away for decades, not for murder, but for the simple crime of being inconvenient. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now tuck in, because we're about to slip into the shadows of one very drafty marriage. You wake up not as a free person, but as someone's problem. Your name is Christina. You once wore gowns with sleeves long enough to trip over, And you knew how to out-negotiate a Viking-descended landowner without raising your voice. And yet, here you are, surrounded by four walls, thicker than the plot of any romantic epic, with the same emotional warmth. Christina of the Isles was married into nobility well. Technically, her husband, the Earl of Ross, owned more land than goats could graze on and had a forehead so furrowed it looked like a poorly plowed field. Their wedding was celebrated with the usual grim medieval joy, lots of ale, too much meat, and a quiet assumption that the bride's opinion would not be needed again. Their marriage was a strategic move. Of course, Christina brought with her status, alliances, and a face the chroniclers annoyingly never describe. Because why bother when she's just a woman? Right. But while many noble wives in the 1300s mastered the art of embroidery and tolerating boarskin furniture, Christina had the audacity to speak. Worse, she seemed to expect her husband to listen. The Earl, unfortunately, preferred things that didn't talk back like horses, axes, and tax ledgers. He soon began to see Christina not as a partner, but as a storm that wouldn't pass. According to local whispers, he once claimed, "She stirs the house like wind over the loch," which sounds poetic until you realize he meant it as an insult. Here's your historical fact for tonight under Scots feudal law. Husbands could discipline wives for unbecoming conduct. What that meant was as vague as it was dangerous. Christina, by all accounts, was not accused of adultery, treason, or witchcraft, just of being too much of a presence. And that, in the right stone building, was enough to erase someone. Quirky footnote. One monk who later recorded her story claimed the Earl was particularly annoyed that Christina insisted on paying musicians in silver instead of chickens. Truly, nothing says marital betrayal like upsetting the poultry-based economy. Historians still argue whether Christina's imprisonment was a personal vendetta, a political maneuver, or just an extreme case of emotional constipation. Either way, by the end of this first act, the door to the tower has shut, and outside, the storm gets louder. You trudge across the same stone floor again, counting the same 4 paces to the window slit and back. That's your cardio for the decade. Outside, there's the same patch of gray sky and a tiny chunk of moorland, which never changes, because apparently, even time has forgotten you exist. You'd kill for a change in scenery, or at least a fresh cheese. The tower isn't exactly a dungeon, but it's not a drawing room either. It's that charming medieval hybrid of house arrest and prison with decorative tapestries. You have a wooden bed frame with a straw mattress that would give any modern chiropractor a full-blown career crisis. There's a chamber pot that's learned the art of passive-aggressive stench, and meals arrive through a tiny door slot with the frequency and nutritional value of an airline tray. Here's a historical fact to ruminate on. Noble women in 14th century Scotland were often viewed as assets to be transferred, not individuals to be consulted. Land, lineage, and marriage were all tied up in a legal tapestry that rarely spared room for emotion. But Christina, locked in a tower, for something as vague as disobedience, it became an anomaly, one that people whispered about, but never tried to rescue. And whisper they did. The servants, of course, no. One elderly cook once said she heard Christina singing through the stone at night, not in English or Gaelic, but in Latin hymns, because nothing says petty revenge like piety echoing through a husband's castle. There were petitions, supposedly, letters smuggled out by sympathetic maids or monks who thought that imprisoning someone for being opinionated was maybe just a bit over the line. But here's the thing. Lines are blurry when the person drawing them owns the ink, the quill, and the head of the local militia. Your quirky tidbit. A small legend says that during a thunderstorm, lightning hit the tower, cracking one of the outer walls. Christina allegedly stood beneath the damage and shouted, "Even God can't stomach this marriage." which, if true, makes her the original medieval mic dropper. Historians still argue whether her confinement was continuous. Some records suggest she may have been moved between estates, possibly allowed short outings. But none of that erases the years lost, the birthdays missed, the silence so long it feels like wallpaper. Meanwhile, outside her tower, the world didn't stop. Scotland was busy tearing itself apart in succession disputes, border raids, and the sort of political drama that could power an entire season of prestige television. Christina, however, was a static footnote, a name scratched into ledgers, a sigh turned into ink, and yet she remained stubbornly alive. The Earl may have buried her behind walls, but she refused to vanish from the memory of those who worked in the Shadows Maids, monks, and maybe one particularly nosy goat herder who claimed she once dropped a note from her window tied to a spoon. So you keep pacing the same 4 steps, because right now, that's the only freedom you're allowed, and somehow, it still feels like defiance. You wake with a start. If you can call this groggy awareness waking, it's the same draft, the same tower, the same inexplicably damp corner of your straw mattress. Outside, some bird is aggressively chirping like it just discovered it's the only free creature left in the realm. You roll your eyes. Then remember, today is day 4372, give or take a leap year. The food this morning, gruel. Again, technically oat-based, emotionally soul-crushing. You don't eat it for taste. You eat it for spite. Now, here's a historical fact to chew with your mush. Noble marriages in 14th century Scotland were frequently arranged while the bride was still in the single digits. Some were married off before they had all their teeth. Because why not if you can't vote? At least you can provide a dowry. Christina was wed at 16, a respectable age for a feudal transaction. Her husband, the Earl, was nearly double that and half as charming as a foggy latrine. The real drama started when she began asking questions, like, why are we funding a monastery instead of feeding tenants? Or shouldn't that servant girl see a physician before she infects the entire kitchen? You know, scandalous, wild things. The kind of dangerous thinking that made a man clutch his rosary and summon a locksmith for the tower door. Here's your quirky tidbit. One chronicler described Christina as having a tongue sharpened by angels, which is possibly a mistranslation of insufferable know-it-all. Depending on the scribe's caffeine intake, either way, it tells you she was no background character. This was a woman who, even when silenced, refused to be quiet. And that's where things get foggy. Historians still argue whether she was imprisoned for religious dissent, political meddling, or just good old-fashioned marital incompatibility. Some say she harbored sympathies for a rival clan. Others think she embarrassed her husband in court by out-debating a bishop. And some romanticize it, all claiming she refused a second marriage after widowhood and paid the price for independence. But none of those accounts explain the day the music stopped. See, for the first few years, she was allowed her harp, a small, carved thing gifted by a cousin from Argyll. She'd play for the wind, for the rain, for the stone walls that never clapped. Then, one day, it vanished. Not broken, not stolen, just not there. And when she asked the guards, they shrugged like confused cats. That was the last time she spoke to them. After that, silence became a kind of performance art. She didn't yell. She didn't plead. She just stared. And somehow, that unnerved them more than any tantrum. A noblewoman who refuses to act broken. That's either a miracle or a menace. You stretch your legs, 4 paces. Window slit. Turn, 4 paces. Today you swear the sky looks a fraction bluer. But maybe that's just hope misfiring. Or maybe it's the ghost of Christina, standing behind your eyes, daring you not to look away. You've been counting things lately, The number of mossy stones between the window and the bed, 12. The breaths it takes for the candle to burn, halfway 178. And most critically, the number of times the guard yawns during his night shift, an impressive 6. Considering he's also asleep for most of it. This is what you do when your world is 10 paces wide and entirely beige. Now here's the mainstream fact. Castles in 14th century Scotland were not exactly the Instagrammable wonders of medieval legend. Sure, they had towers. And yes, those towers had views if you were an owl. But most were cold, dark, and smelled like damp wool and tax evasion. Christina's prison was likely a keepstone walls, narrow slits for windows, and a toilet system known as a garderobe, which is French for slightly suicidal, balcony over a moat. One monk later described her room as fit for contemplation and repentance, which is medieval PR speak for we stuck a lady in a closet and hoped she'd shut up. But Christina did not go quietly into the garderobe, at least, not at first. Some records say she was visited by a priest every fortnight. Others claim she was banned from speaking to anyone at all. The truth. A woman locked away for 30 years doesn't get many biographers. What we do know is that she left faint marks on the wall, scratches that seem random, unless you know the old Celtic counting rhyme. They form cycles of 7s. 7 days. 7 saints. 7 years. That's your quirky detail for tonight. Medieval people loved 7s. If it wasn't holy, it was magical. If it wasn't magical, it was suspiciously foreign. So naturally, 7 became Christina's private way of pushing back. Her calendar, her diary, her middle finger to eternity. Oh. Sometimes you imagine her pacing that same line you pace now, muttering under her breath about the Earl, about justice, about soup so bland it could erase memory, her hair slowly turning to silver, her hands cracked from cold, yet her spine never curling, still royal, still herself. Historians still argue whether her family knew where she was. Some suggest they believed her dead. Others propose they bribed the Earl to keep her quiet. In a fringe theory, very fringe, says she was hiding willingly, a self-imposed exile to escape political scandal. Which sounds romantic until you realize that even voluntary solitude becomes a cage when the door stays locked. 1 year, the Earl died, and nothing happened. No key turned, no guards saluted. Silence got heavier. It was as if she'd been forgotten by everyone but the wind. You think about that while staring at your own tiny window slit. A bird lands on the edge. Not a dove, not a raven, just a common, indecisive sparrow. It hops once, twice, then flies away. You envy it with a surprising amount of bitterness. You dream of bread. Not just any bread, warm, soft, golden-skinned, butter-clad bread, the kind that makes teeth ache and souls heal. But when you wake, all you have is the medieval breakfast menu. Yesterday's porridge, if you're lucky. And if not, there's always water with a hint of moss, gently served in a chipped wooden bowl that looks like it once moonlighted as a chamber pot. Now, we delve into the months after Christina's captor the Earl died. You might expect the story to perk up. But no, we're still in Scotland in the 1300s, where optimism is considered a flaw of character. The estate passed to a cousin. Not a kind cousin. Not even a competent one. Just a man who inherited a title and a roster of people he couldn't be bothered to learn the names of, including one very silent woman in a locked tower. This is your historical fact. Medieval succession was as messy as a stew, with too many carrots and not enough meat. Power passed through blood. Marriage, or bribes, often all three, and inconvenient leftovers, like imprisoned wives, were usually ignored. After all, they weren't in anyone's way. They just sat and waited. But Christina didn't vanish. Not entirely. Here's the quirky bit local villagers whispered about the ghost widow. Children dared each other to run past the castle wall and shout her name. Lady Christina, they'd squeal, before bolting like their feet were on fire. Some said they saw a pale face at the window. Others claimed she left notes and cracks of stone spells, maybe, or poems, or just lists of the things she wanted to eat. Which brings us to the scholars, who, bless them, still argue whether these stories are true or just rural drama. One historian insists the ghost widow tales were invented centuries later to sell postcards at the ruins. Another argues they prove the villagers always knew she was alive. A third suggests that Lady Christina became folklore precisely because no one rescued her. She was too awkward for legend, too inconvenient for justice, so she became a bedtime story. But what if she heard those voices, those shrieks of children on a dare, calling out to her like a forgotten goddess in a crumbling shrine? Did her heart leap? Did she think today might be the day? And then, did she stop thinking that? Year by year, you settle back on your hay mattress, if you can call it that. More like a fabric suggestion, filled with old straw and possibly a rat. The walls creak. The moon slips behind a cloud. You wrap your arms tighter around your ribs, not for warmth, but just to remember, you still have them. Sometimes. You wonder if Christina imagined conversations, built whole dialogues out of creaks and wind, and the occasional delivery of food. After all, solitude is not silence. It talks back. It laughs at you. It invents someone who will argue, just so you can win. You listen to the quiet. But now, it sounds like someone else is breathing. You're not dead. But the furniture might be. The stool under you gives a kind of ancient sigh every time you shift. One more wiggle, and it might disintegrate into splinters and betrayal. Welcome back to 14th century Scotland, where chairs are optional, privacy is illegal, and most people's emotional support animal is a particularly judgmental goat. Now we approach the halfway point in Christina's sentence, if you can call it that. 15 years. That's how long it had been since she last walked outdoors? Since she heard laughter not meant for her? Since she felt the wind on her face without it sneaking in through a crack? You might think that after a decade and a half of being locked in a tower, things couldn't get worse. But this is history, and you'd be wrong. This is where your mainstream historical fact arrives with a thud in 14th century Scotland. It wasn't illegal for noble families to imprison their own. In fact, there was something of a tradition of locking away troublesome relatives sometimes for religious reasons, sometimes for inheritance squabbles, and sometimes because they married poorly. Christina's situation wasn't rare, just unusually long. And that brings us to the juicy. Weird bit letters were found centuries later, referring to the woman upstairs in accounts of household food deliveries. 1 loaf for the lady upstairs, boiled parsnips, 1 bowl, tower, as if she were some mysterious tenant in an Airbnb run by ogres. Historians still argue whether those records refer to Christina herself or a later, even more unfortunate relative. Some insist it's her. Others suggest it's all hearsay creative interpretation of vague logs by bored archivists. But a handful of researchers believe she left marks. Actual carvings in the stone wall tally marks, notches, whole lines of scratches, organized by weeks or months, or desperate guesses at time. You run your hand over the wooden walls of your imaginary room. Nothing here is smooth. Everything has texture, like memory made tangible. That's how the mind survives confinement. It sculpts stories out of the stone. You make a pet from the drip in the corner. You name the shadow on the floor. You imagine escape, just so you don't forget what doors are. And Christina, she aged in reverse. Not in the magical, glowing Hollywood sense, but in isolation. The outside world became younger, stranger, and faster than her. While she remained fixed like a painting no one dusts. The clothes she wore became outdated. The names she remembered faded from public memory. New nobles replaced the old ones. But she stayed the same, like a question that no one answered, but everyone tiptoed around. You wonder what her voice sounded like after all those years. Raspy small? Or did she practice speaking to keep it strong? Maybe she whispered conversations to herself. Maybe she argued loudly with the walls, just to remind them who was boss. Or maybe, most haunting of all, she forgot the tone of her own laugh. You lie down, staring at the ceiling. You tell yourself you're just resting your eyes, but deep down, you know you're waiting like Christina for someone to knock, for someone to say your name like it still means something. You'd think, after 15 years, someone would start asking questions. You know, like, hey, where's Christina? Or, didn't we used to have a daughter-in-law? But no silence. Apparently, in 14th century Scotland, if you didn't show up to family dinner for 3 decades, people just assumed you joined a nunnery, married a ghost, or become part of the furniture. Now, we approach a delicate moment in this grim fairy tale rumors begin to circulate. Not from the family, of course not. They were too busy rewriting history with the quiet efficiency of people who didn't want to get caught. But from servants, cooks, traveling merchants, people who weren't supposed to notice, but always do. And this is where your quirky fringe detail slides in like a rogue spoon in a soup bowl, the tale of the lady in the window. Locals in Caithness whispered about a pale figure, sometimes glimpsed at the top tower slit. A flutter of white fabric. A moving shadow behind glass, so old it distorted faces like melted wax. Children dared each other to throw stones at the wall and run. Some claimed to hear faint music, even laughter, though it could have been the wind. But wind rarely hums lullabies. Historical fact-time castle staff turnover in the 1300s was notoriously high. But the Gordon household kept a strangely consistent number of long-term servants. Some speculate it was to maintain the secret. And food deliveries to the upper chamber never stopped. Which is, let's face it, a lot of extra porridge for someone allegedly dead. Now cue the open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Christina had any contact with the outside world during her imprisonment. Some say she bribed guards or sent notes hidden in embroidery. Others insist she was entirely cut off, except for mealtimes. And a particularly dramatic camp of scholars believes she went mad and began to believe the walls themselves were friends. There is, allegedly, a 15th century poem unsigned that describes a bride in stone who speaks to time alone. Romantic, yes. Confirmable, not at all. But here's the part that slinks into your brain when the fire dies down and the wind moans just right. What if she never gave up hope? What if, year after year, she truly believed that someone was coming back for her, that the door would creak open, her name would be spoken gently, and the nightmare would end. You picture her now, sitting upright on a bed as hard as a moral dilemma. A beam of moonlight cuts through the window slit like a sword through silence. She's holding a letter, or maybe just imagining one, reading it aloud to herself for the 100th time. A message never written, from a husband never returned, from a world that kept spinning while she stood still. And still, she waits, even if it's just inside her mind, even if time is dissolved into a puddle of maybe. The tower holds its breath, and then finally a door creaks. Not in her dreams, not in the echo of her own footsteps circling endlessly in a room barely large enough to stretch grief, but in real life, or what's left of it. The year is 1470, give or take a clerical error. Her son, Sir Robert Gordon, now a man with silver in his beard and responsibilities in his eyes, decides casually, inexplicably, that it's time to let Mother out. as though he just remembered she was in there, as if she were a pantry item being rotated for freshness. You don't get a great ceremony. No trumpets, no choir. A servant walks up the stairs with a key and a candle, which flickers so nervously it might have preferred to stay downstairs. The door opens, and what they find inside is not quite a ghost, not quite a woman, something in between. Christina steps forward, and every joint in her body sounds like a dry stick cracking underfoot. Her eyes adjust to the light like someone seeing heaven, or maybe just a better version of hell. Her clothes, faded to the color of old regrets. Her hair, long enough to carry stories in the strands. She says nothing. Here's the mainstream historical fact. There are documented records in local Scottish chronicles that note Christina Bruce by name being released from confinement in the later years of the 15th century. And no, it wasn't a clerical mistake. It was just another Tuesday in the annals of noble family things that shouldn't have happened but totally did. The fringe tidbit upon release. She reportedly asked only for 3 things: a hot bath, a simple meal, and to visit a certain birch tree in the garden. No one knows why. Some claim she buried something there. A locket, a letter, a life she didn't get to live. Others say it was just the one spot where the wind sounded like freedom. Historians still argue whether Christina was rescued or simply released because the family could no longer maintain the illusion. Some believe a clerical inquiry was pending, or a suspicious bishop got nosy. Others suggest Sir Robert had a fit of guilt or indigestion that turned spiritual. But here's what's even more bizarre. She lived. Not just barely. She lived on. Outside those stone walls. For several more years. Quietly. Peacefully. Like a woman who'd made peace with time itself. You sit with this: she never married again. Never spoke publicly of what happened. Never sought revenge or justice or answers. Instead, she kept bees. Yes, bees. In little clay hives set along the sunniest side of the garden wall. And when children came to visit, she gave them honey and told them stories with talking animals and silent queens. You wonder, was that healing or hiding? Was that the sound of someone reclaiming life, or just whispering to the years like they were still behind bars? The tower now stands empty, but the wind, it still carries lullabies. Sometimes. The world doesn't apologize. It doesn't send a letter. It doesn't drop a fruit basket. It just moves on, like nothing happened. And in 15th century Scotland, that's exactly what it did. Christina Bruce lives out her final years, not in a blaze of vindication, but in the quiet corners of someone else's estate. A guest on land she once helped defend. A mother to a man she barely knew. A relic from a past no one wanted to dust off. She's not bitter, or at least, not loudly. She drinks her tea, if you can call it that. It's more like hay steeped in regret, and walks her garden with the limp of someone who once believed a wall couldn't hold a soul. And every evening, as the sun settles into the mossy hills like an old man in a rocking chair, she hums just a few notes. Over and over. A melody no one can name. A tune you only learn in the silence of 30 years. Remember that birch tree? The one she asked to see first after leaving her prison. Turns out, she visits it daily. She places a hand on its bark. She talks to it. Laughs. Sometimes. Locals say she buries scraps of paper at its roots. Prayers, poems, shopping lists. Nobody knows. Because she never tells. Because some chapters are hers alone. Here's your historical fact to chew on like crusty oat bread. Christina's story wasn't just forgotten. It was suppressed. Written off as house arrest or noble protection. But even the most padded cell is still a cell when the door only opens from the outside. A lesser-known detail: one of her grandchildren, named Lost to Time, became a minor poet wrote one surviving verse about a lady in a tower who spoke to the moon. Most scholars missed it. Others argue it was about a saint. But you know better. Historians still argue whether Christina's 30-year confinement was out of necessity, cruelty, or politics wrapped in a tartan bow. Some say she was a threat. Others say she was simply inconvenient, a woman with land, a name, and too much silence for comfort. But you don't need to decide. You just lie there, sinking into your blanket like peat moss, letting the winds of the highlands blow through time. You imagine the birch tree still standing. You imagine the tower now filled with ivy. And you imagine Christina, humming, long after anyone listened. The past doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And if you're quiet enough, if the room is still, and the blanket just warm enough, you can hear her. The creak of a wooden floorboard, the clink of iron keys, a breath in the dark, and then nothing. Sleep now. Let the wind close the door behind you.